Did you know only 200 years ago the Muslims were a majority in the Crimean Peninsula? The Crimean Tatars are a Turkic ethnic group native to the Crimean Peninsula and speak a language that derives from the Kipchak language family. The formation of the Crimean Tatar ethnicity begins in the 7th century as Turkic peoples began to settle in Crimea due to the emergence of the Khazar Khanate. They were then followed by another Turkic people group known as the Kipchaks that began to dominate the region from the 11th century onwards. Further Turkic migration occurred when Batu Khan conquered Crimea in 1239, bringing with him around 30,000 Kipchak soldiers. The Crimean Peninsula was then incorporated into the expanding Mongol Empire. However, in only a few short years, the empire fractured into 5 smaller nation-states, in which Crimea was a part of the newly formed Golden Horde in 1242. Around this time, the local Kipchaks started to take the name Tatars. It is also presumed that the Genoese and Crimean Goths were assimilated into the Tatar ethnic group. The Islamification of the Crimean Tatars began in 1313 when the leader of the Golden Horde, Uzbek Khan, became Muslim, making Islam the state religion, in which the Crimean Tatar language switched from a Turkic alphabet to the Arabic script. However, following the Black Death that ravaged the Old World in the 1340s was one of the contributing factors that led to the Golden Horde's downfall. A fatal blow to the Horde was dealt by Tamerlane, who annihilated Tokhtamish's army, destroyed his capital, looted the Crimean trade centers, and deported most of the skillful craftsmen to his own capital in Samarkand. Eventually, the Tatars dropped their nomadic lifestyle and decided to make Crimea their homeland. This caused separatism to rise in the region, in which they called upon a descendant of Genghis Khan, Hassi Giray, to become their new Khan. From 420 to 441, he fought a war of independence against the Golden Horde. However, it was not until 1449 that Hassi Giray claimed full sovereignty, as he was challenged by others who believed that they had a claim to the throne. Despite this, the Crimean Khanate shared the Crimean Peninsula with the Genoese, who had tried to regain their ports and cities in the south and southwest of Crimea. In 1466, Hassi Giray's son, Mengli, ascended to the throne, and 9 years later, in 1475, he requested for Ottoman assistance, in which he wanted to rid out the last remaining Italian presence within the peninsula. The Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, used this opportunity to increase the port's military presence in North Crimea, and sent his admiral, Gedik Ahmed Pasha. Subsequently, the steppe political system would become much more centralized, with a definite Ottoman presence, a process catalyzed and encouraged by the Ottoman port. This centralization benefited the port in that the empire could eventually control the Khanate's succession. The empire's ultimate interest in such control was predicated on Crimean stability, a steady supply of slaves, and agricultural exports. Though in the same year, in 1475, Ahmed Pasha captured Menli, in which he released him only 3 years later after he accepted Ottoman suzerainty, in which they signed a treaty that recognized the Khan's authority over internal political and military issues, though the Ottoman Sultan was a sovereign of Crimea, in which he regulated the Crimean Khanate's foreign affairs. Despite this treaty, the Khan was treated as an ally rather than a subject, as their objectives in expanding the Dar al-Islam through conquest was similar. Therefore, the sultans allowed the Khans to administer their own internal affairs and did not collect a regular tribute. This allowed for the Crimean Khanate to maintain independence despite the rising power of Russia. The most notable victory in the Crimean Khanate was when Khan Muhammad Giray captured Astrakhan in 1522. Most importantly, he defeated the Muscovites, burning suburbs within their capital. Though Crimean success came to an abrupt end just a year later when Muhammad Giray was killed by Nogai tribesmen. Though fortune was again on the side of the Crimeans, as Sahib Giray captured Kazan and took Astrakhan with Ottoman assistance in 1549. This sudden growth in power aroused the suspicion of the Ottomans, in which they prepared to replace Sahib Giray with Devlet Giray. As a result of this turmoil, Ivan IV took advantage by moving towards Kazan and capturing it in 1552. And 2 years later, in 1554, he captured Astrakhan, in which now he could proclaim himself as the true heir of the Golden Horde. Though later, Khan Devlet Giray launched a direct attack on Moscow in 1571, in which he defeated the Russians and marched towards Moscow, burning its outskirts, but failed in his main purpose, the recovery of Kazan and Astrakhan. However, Devlet Giray's successors knew they could not be the true inheritors of the Golden Horde and focused their attention on the Danube and the Caucasus region. The Crimean Khanate tried to form an alliance with the Cossacks, a Christian Orthodox people group, but failed. However, in the 17th and 18th centuries, the Khans started to lose their power due to domestic instability. The leaders of local clans, the Beys, possessed certain wealth, political and military power, and became less dependent on the Khans, acting on their own without the Khan's consent. And by the end of the 16th century, the Ottomans began settling the Crimean Tatars in the Dobruja region, which is an area on the Black Sea coast that encompasses modern-day Bulgaria and Romania. Furthermore, during the same time, the Crimean Tatars began to migrate to Poland, Lithuania, and Belarus, alongside Tatars within the Kazan Khanate, in which they formed the Lipka Tatar ethnic group. The word Lipka is the Crimean word for Lithuania. Another critical historical development in the history of Eastern Europe was Russia's domination of its western portion in the mid-17th century. Initially, it seemed that their rivals, the Crimeans, were on the brink of this achievement. The Khan Islam Giray III then marched upon the Christian powers and secured the alliance of Bohdan Khmelnytsky, head of the Ukrainian Cossacks on the Dnieper. Khmelnytsky proposed a Cossack state in Ukraine and offered to become a vassal of the Ottoman Empire, though the Ottomans were unable to provide adequate support to Islam Giray, as they were entangled in a crisis in Transylvania, as well as the Cretan campaign against the Venetians between 1645 to 1669. The failure of the Ottomans to assist the Khan at such a critical juncture led him to bid for peace. In turn, Khmelnytsky came to an agreement with the Russians, signing the Agreement of Pereyaslav in 654. In 1686, Russia joined the Holy League, and in an effort to reach its long-sought goal of the Black Sea, attempted to take advantage of the retreat of the Ottomans in Eastern Europe, in which they attempted 2 invasions of Crimea. However, they did not have the capabilities to achieve victory. The Crimean Tatars played a crucial role in the Turkish defeat of Tsar Peter I in his attempted invasion of the Ottoman Empire in 1711. Though by 1736, the Russians managed to breach the defences at Perekop and attack Basarsai. The Khan's palace was reduced to ashes, as were approximately 2,000 houses. They continued their depredations, and over the next 2 years, in 739, secured the Azov castle in the Treaty of Belgrade. But it was the war of 1768 to 1774 which proved disastrous for the Crimean Khanate, in which they were invaded in 1771, resulting in the Treaty of Kusok-Kainarsa of 1774, which ended the war and signalled the Ottomans' loss of Crimea. This rendered the Khanate as an independent nation-state, ruling in Crimea as well as in the steppe between the Bug and the Kuban rivers. The historian Alan Fisher stated that the independence of Crimea during this period was no more than a sham perpetuated by the force of the Russian arms. Rather, it was a transitional period between Ottoman suzerainty and Russian suzerainty. The new Khan, Shahin Giray, tried to implement a series of policies that would modernize the nation. However, this proved costly as a series of revolts occurred. This was used by Catherine II to formally end Crimean independence by annexing it in 1783. Although the Ottomans undertook a new war in 1787 to save Crimea, they were again defeated. As a result, in the Treaty of Jassy of 1792, they were compelled to relinquish their claims to the entire territory up to the Dniester. The Russian conquest of Crimea brought an end to the Crimean Tatar slave raids, in which hundreds of thousands of people from Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and the Caucasus region were captured, in which they were subsequently sold into the Crimean Tatar slave markets. And it is estimated that 75% of the Crimean population were either slaves or freedmen. Initially, during Catherine II's rule, she gave religious freedoms to the Muslims, as the Crimeans were to enjoy the same duties and privileges as did his counterparts in Russia. Later pursued a systematic systematic policy to remove the Tatar Muslim population from Crimea, in which policies were made in order to Russify the Tatar ethnic group. Over time, the Russian authorities rooted out any cultural heritage linked to the Crimean Tatars. Most place names were changed to imply that Crimea was originally Orthodox Christian and was later invaded by the Muslims. They damaged and demolished buildings and monuments of cultural importance. Furthermore, Russification of the peninsula allowed for the fulfillment of huge economic and commercial potential that Crimea possessed, which would enable them to reach towards Istanbul and the Mediterranean. It is estimated by the time of Russian annexation in 1783, the Crimean Tatar population within the peninsula was between 80 to 90%. However, immediately upon Tsarist rule, between 150 to 200,000 Crimean Tatars left out of a population of 500,000, in which tens of thousands migrated to Buchak. However, following the Russian conquest in 1812, these Crimean Tatars then migrated to Dobruja, and by the start of the 1800s, it is estimated that there were around 100,000 Russian settlers in the former areas of the Crimean Khanate. The next wave of migration occurred between 1800 to 1812 due to the Napoleon advances into Russian territory. Upon the Russian invasion of the Ottoman province of Rumelia in 1853, the war expanded into the Crimean Peninsula the following year, as France, Britain and the Ottomans had growing fears of the Russian expansion, therefore targeting the vulnerable spots of the empire, most notably Crimea. False intelligence had portrayed the idea that the Tatars had fought against them. This led to the news spreading to newspapers across the capital, rendering the entire Tatar population suspect in the view of the Tsarist administration. As a result, migration was encouraged, with around 200,000 Crimean Tatars leaving out of a population of 300,000. And it is estimated that the total Tatar population within Crimea reduced to 1/3. Furthermore, Crimean Tatars perished in the process of immigration, with many drowning while crossing the Black Sea, though those that survived became known as muhacirs and settled in Ottoman territories, with many setting up communities across the Dobruja, in which the Tatar population at the time was estimated to be at 21% of northern Dobruja. However, following the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, Romania became an independent nation state. This began a process of Romanianization for the Crimean Tatars, in which they suffered oppression, xenophobia and harassment due to their ethnic background. This led to an exodus of between 80 to 100,000 Crimean Tatars that fled within the modern-day borders of Turkey. However, in the remaining decades of the 19th century, in order to prevent the considerable economic damage that would accrue from another mass migration like one that followed the Crimean War, the authorities used various means to stop the emigration, ranging from persecution to the use of force. One of these ways was to address the Tatar population through the regional Muslim spiritual assemblies, which complied with the government's request to proclaim there was no need to emigrate out of Russia. Another method was to appeal through newspapers printed in the Tatar language, which sought to convince readers of the dangers of emigration and the need to remain in Russia. Less peaceful methods included arresting and returning illegal emigrants or even shooting them. At the same time, the intellectual Ismail Gasparali began to have an influence within Crimea. He believed that the conservative Muslim clergy had to give way for a new modern thinking. He believed that the Crimean Tatars would eventually be Russified, unless these new schools would impact both their cultural heritage and the skills necessary for survival and success in the modern world. He even made his own school in Basra Sarai, in which traditional Arabic courses in the Quran and Islamic law were accompanied in these schools by history, geography, mathematics courses taught in the Russian language and the Tatar language. Gasparali also wanted to use his new method of education as an instrument to meld all the Turkic peoples in the Russian Empire into a single modern Turkish nation, in which he believed it was the only solution in the entangled social, economic and political issues they faced as well as to grow in power. Despite his interest in educational reforms, Gasparoli discouraged his followers from putting up any political opposition to the Russian government, in which he believed there was little chance of success in such resistance. On the contrary, he emphasized and promoted the need for close collaboration between Russians and the Muslim peoples living in the country. Gasparoli found a receptive audience for his ideas in the class of intellectuals who had received education in the new Russian Tatar schools, primarily his own school and the Tatar Teachers' School in Akhmesid. As a result, the Young Tatars were formed, which was seen as the first modern political movement by the Crimean Tatars, but was later dissolved by the Russians in 1910. In 1908, another Crimean Tatar nationalist group was formed, known as the Crimean Student Society, and was influenced by the Young Turks in the Ottoman Empire. And in the following year, in 1909, they founded an offshoot, Vetan, which sought to establish an independent state in Crimea. Upon the collapse of the Tsarist regime in 1917, Russia descended into a bloody civil war, in which Crimea was a part of the conflict, changing hands multiple times. There were three political entities that were fighting for power at the time: the Tatar National Directory, the Crimean Provincial Assembly, the Organization of Russian and Ukrainian Liberals in Crimea, as well as the Bolsheviks. As a result, the Crimean People's Republic declared independence in 1917, in which the Crimean Tatar nationalists from the Young Tatars, Crimean Student Society and the Vetan played a crucial role in bringing this into fruition. Furthermore, the Mufti of Crimea, Lithuania and Poland, Numan Celebisan, became the president. However, this was short-lived, as by early 1918, the Bolsheviks had retaken back control of the peninsula, making it the Tarid SSR, though this was later lost to the Lipka Tatar general Masiej Sulkiewicz, also known as Suleiman, who was appointed Prime Minister of the Crimean Regional Government. Though the following year, in 1919, the Soviet Union temporarily re-established control in Crimea, but was then lost to the White Army with the establishment of the General Command of the Armed Forces of South Russia, though finally the USSR had permanently become the rulers of Crimea by 1920, in which the Bolsheviks purged anyone they deemed an opponent, with 60,000 Crimean Tatars falling victim. And it is estimated by the time the USSR fully established control in Crimea, the Tatar population was 25%. Initially, upon the Crimean ASSR being established, the Romanian Tatars had enjoyed many rights, such as the recognition of their language on the same footing as Russian. Furthermore, theatres, schools and newspapers were funded in the language. However, following a widespread famine in the Soviet Union in 1921, it is estimated that 100,000 Crimean Tatars perished. Furthermore, in total, from 1783 to 1921, 1.8 million Crimean Tatars fled from the peninsula. And by 1928, the Arabic script, which had been used by the Crimean Tatars, was replaced with the Latin alphabet. Another change occurred 10 years later when it was again changed into the Cyrillic alphabet. Another famine had ravished the Soviet Union between 1930 to 1933, in which it is estimated that 150,000 Crimean Tatars either died or fled, and it is noted by historians that the Crimean Tatar population shrunk in half. The Crimean Tatars also had to leave Romania, as on the 4th of September 1936, the convention regarding the Turkish and Tatar population from Dobruja was signed. The first two articles were establishing the areas, the places and the emigration phases. This way, the Turks and the Tatars who lived in Kaliakra, Dorostor, Constanta and Tolesa counties were within the scope of the convention. The emigration process was meant to take 5 years. And on the 15th of April 1936, 15,000 Crimean Tatar inhabitants had to leave. However, those that remained in Romania enjoyed certain rights after World War II, as from 1947 to 1957, schools in the Tatar language began operating. The worst was yet to come for the Crimean Tatars, as in May 1944, Joseph Stalin decreed that the entire Crimean Tatar population were to be deported to Uzbekistan, as they were deported on the basis that they helped the Germans during their occupation of Crimea, as 15 to 20,000 Crimean Tatars fought for the Germans against partisans in the Crimean mountains. Despite this, 65,000 50,000 Crimean Tatars joined the Russians to fight the Axis invasion. The Soviets had tried to cover the deaths, but it is estimated that 46% of the 200,000 deportees died on the way to Central Asia. And at the same time, all elements of Tatar presence, culture and heritage were destroyed, with Ukrainians and Russians being settled in these former areas. Meanwhile, in exile, they were confined to the area they had been banished to and had to report to the authorities once a month. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of Russians and Ukrainians were settled in the farms, houses and villages of these deportees, and it is estimated that 90% of the Slavic population of Crimea moved after the war. The Crimean ASSR was abolished in 1945 and was reorganized into the Crimean Oblast of the RSFSR within the Russian Soviet Republic. And 9 years later, in 1954, it was transferred under the jurisdiction of Ukrainian SSR due to the close geographic, economic and cultural ties to Ukraine, as well as being a friendly gesture symbolizing the 300th anniversary of the treaty which unified Russia and Ukraine. In 1956, Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech sought out to de-Stalinize the Soviet Union, in which the many ethnic groups that were deported under Stalin were given the chance to return home. However, this was not the case for the Crimean Tatars. And it is estimated by the 1970s the Crimean Tatar population in the peninsula was only 15,000. This meant that the Tatar population in their native homeland of Crimea was 2%. And it was not until the Soviet Union collapsed that in May 1990, around 83,000 Crimean Tatars returned to their ancestral homeland from exile. This continued, and by the mid-1990s, it is estimated 250,000 Crimean Tatars returned. However, the Ukrainian authorities did not grant permission to own land, and representatives of the Crimean Tatar people were not employed, and they were not sold houses either. Though these problems were eventually resolved. Meanwhile, many of the Crimean Tatars were not able to return back home due to the fact that the standard of living in Central Asia was different, meaning they could not afford the same housing back in Crimea, which was exacerbated by the post-Soviet inflation that ravished many former republics. Furthermore, a cultural revival occurred amongst the Crimean Tatars, in which theatres were reopened and the right for the language to be taught in schools was approved, with a total of 20 schools being in the Crimean Tatar language. By 2010, they had their own governing bodies and were represented in the Parliament of Ukraine in proportion to their population size. Upon the Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014, the Kremlin rule of the Tatars has been mixed, as they have shut down an estimated 250 active Crimean Tatar Mejlis on the charges of extremism, though the new Russian local authorities within the peninsula promised to help preserve the Tatar religion and culture. Furthermore, they declared a 20% Crimean Tatar quota in government positions. Today, most sources suggest that the Crimean Tatar population is estimated to be just over 14% of the peninsula's population, numbering just under 300,000. Meanwhile, a slightly smaller number of 260,000 Crimean Tatars still live in exile in Uzbekistan. As a result of the mass migration to Ottoman territories, it is estimated that between 1 to 5 million people in Turkey are of Crimean Tatar descent. However, it is difficult to have an exact figure due to the many assimilation policies that were implemented after Ataturk had led the Turkish nationalist movement to victory. This is due to the surname law, the banning of non-Turkish languages, and the changing of village names, leading to everyone assimilating into the pan-Turkish identity. Meanwhile, in Romania, it is estimated that there are around 50,000 Crimean Tatars and enjoy no forms of oppression. This is because there are no active policies of Romanianization going on. This is also the same for the remaining 6,000 Crimean Tatars in Bulgaria.